Hello, my name is Carol Cains and I'm the Senior Curator of Asian Art at the National Gallery of Australia in Canberra. I would like to thank the committee of the 50 years golden anniversary of the Museums Association in Yogyakarta, and in particular Daniel Harrio-Diningrat for inviting me to speak at this conference. I look forward to developing new contacts and sharing a small part of the Indonesian collection of the National Gallery of Australia with you today. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Aboriginal, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, the traditional custodians of the Canberra region, and to pay my respects to their elders. A focus area within the National Gallery's Asian collection is the art of Southeast Asia, as mandated in the Lindsay Report of 1966, which set out the guidelines for the Australian National Collection. One of the main areas of the new institution's collection, along with Australian art and international modern and contemporary art, was to be the art of the region around Australia, that is, Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The inaugural director, James Mollison, recognised the importance of textiles within this geographic area, not only in terms of their significant status and key social roles, but also, and more importantly for the gallery, their superb aesthetic qualities. Accordingly, Southeast Asian textiles were acquired from 1977, and Indonesian textiles became a focus in 1980 with the establishment of the Indonesian Textiles Advisory Committee. The committee comprised the director and 4 Australian specialists in Indonesian art: Robin Maxwell, John Maxwell, Professor Anthony Forge, and Associate Professor James Fox. With the advantage of their expertise, combined with the network of dealers and collectors they quickly formed, and encouragement and support of colleagues such as Dr. Maribel Gidinja from the Textile Museum, Washington, the committee was able to begin building the exemplary Southeast Asian textile collection that the National Gallery is renowned for today. When the Department of Asian Art was formally established in 1988, the committee was disbanded. However, the Indonesian textile collection continued to grow under the expert guidance of Robin Maxwell in the role of curator, and later senior curator. Today, the Indonesian textile collection numbers around 1,250 works and includes around 280 Javanese batik textiles. Batik textiles were acquired from various sources, including dealers, collectors, and artists. In 1984, the gallery acquired 128 batik textiles from the collection of Indonesian batik artist and collector Iwan Tirta Mijaja, who is shown here with the Textiles Committee in that year. The group included 14 batiks designed by Kanjeng Raden Tumenggung Harjonegoro. 5 of them are currently on display, as seen in the right of the slide, including one with a pattern of orchids. Today I would like to discuss the 3 batik textiles in the National Collection that are decorated with imagery drawn from European fairy tales. Batiks decorated with fairy tales were popular by the end of the 19th century. As you can see, their imagery is drawn from 3 stories: Thumbelina in the top left, Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, lower left, and Little Red Riding Hood in the top right. They were made in Pekalongan in the Javanese North Coast region known as the Pesisir. 2 of them are signed, so we know they were made in the ateliers of Leanne Metzeler, Little Red Riding Hood, and Susanna Elizabeth Bauer, Snow White. They were both Indo-European batik entrepreneurs of Dutch descent. We do not know the source of the 3rd textile, Thumbelina. It has been proposed that it was made in a Peranakan Chinese atelier. The first batik workshop run by a European female entrepreneur was that established by Carolina Josephine von Frankmont in 1840. She is credited with introducing fairy tales as subjects for batik designs. She organised an innovative batik manufacturing model that was followed in later workshops. The entrepreneurs supervised the entire batik process on their premises, hiring Javanese female batikers and Javanese dyers and fabric preparators. Designs were created either by the entrepreneurs, by Javanese artisans who worked to the entrepreneurs' instructions, or, in the case of the fairy tale batiks, freelance artisans known as tukang sungging, who made enlarged copies of European book illustrations and prints and reproduced them many times in pencil on paper. The drawings were sold to batik entrepreneurs and they were used as the basis of tracings. In wax, designs were copied, swapped and sold, and that is why many fairy tale characters appear in identical or similar forms on different batik textiles. The National Gallery fairy tale batiks are characteristic of the genre and illustrate the skill, style and palette of Javanese North Coast batiks around the first decade of the 20th century. The colour scheme of the three works indicate they were made before the widespread adoption of synthetic dyes, which were introduced from Germany in the 1890s. Let's look at each of these textiles in some detail. The first batik we will look at is a Cains sarong or skirt cloth depicting Little Red Riding Hood, known in Dutch as Roodkapje, by Leon Metzelaar, dated around 1905. The story of Little Red Riding Hood is known in many versions. It was adapted from earlier folk tales by Charles Perrault in the 17th century and the Brothers Grimm in the 19th century. Leon Metzelaar's workshop ran from 1880 to 1915 or 19. She was a widow by the time she established her workshop and initially also undertook other work, including flower arranging for festivals. This experience may have influenced her designs for the floral bouquet or bukatan, which characterized Indo-European batiks from the 1920s and which she pioneered. Note that this textile is sewn into a tube along the weft direction, so that it is in the sarong skirt form rather than a long rectangular skirt cloth or kain panjang. All of the batiks discussed here were originally sewn into sarongs and were therefore probably worn. Two have been unpicked, probably to make them more saleable for display as works of art. The central character of the fairy tale, the little girl called Red Riding Hood, is shown 3 times with the wolf under a bare tree. She holds a basket containing the food she is taking to her grandmother, who is ill. She also carries a bouquet of flowers in her right hand, which is raised. Her hair is in one long plait tied with a bow which hangs over her shoulder. She appears to wear a dress and a shawl and the distinctive red cap that gives her her name, Red Riding Hood or Roodkapje. The images of the girl, the wolf and the tree encapsulates a key moment in the narrative when the wolf meets the girl as she journeys through the forest to her grandmother's house. It's the most common form of this very popular fairy tale motif and is reproduced in many examples. Here's a detail of the main 2 figures. Image sources for the main figures include children's books and prints, which were widely disseminated among the Dutch community in Java. For floral bouquets, borders and minor motifs, needlework and fashion magazines, such as the Dutch fashion magazine Alaya, may have been consulted. You can see if you look at these images that the pose of the young girl with her hand raised holding a bouquet of flowers is reproduced in one of the middle prints. And also the position of the wolf, rather like a domesticated dog next to the figure of Little Red Riding Hood, is seen in many of these prints. The costume details are also quite similar to those seen in the batik image. Differences between elements of the design confirm that it is hand-drawn batik tulis and not stamped batik cap, in which case the same images would be repeated. We can see minor differences between the wolf here. Little Red Riding Hood batiks were very popular and survive in both drawn and stamped versions. The background of the badan or the body of the batik is a geometric background or isen pattern named ret saret, meaning fine-tooth comb. Background linear geometric patterns in a herringbone checkerboard or basket weave design are characteristic of fairy tale batiks made in Indo-European workshops. Examples with this style of background are published from the Rudolf G. Smend collection, including another fairy tale batik depicting the story of Cinderella. And you can see that the same basket weave background pattern and the similar palette of black, blue, beige and red that we see in the Little Red Riding Hood batik from the National Collection is seen here. The kapala or the feature panel of the sarong is signed at the top right, L. Metz, Peck, for Leon Metzelaar Pekalongen. The abbreviation was adopted by Metzelaar around 1890, as was the pingir or the border motif of 4 flowers alternating with 7 leaves on a slender branch, seen here on the upper border, where it was invariably located, and that's at the top of the slide. Metzelaar's workshop is also indicated by the simple bird form that appears in the Kapala. Flowers that appear on the Kapala include carnations, forget-me-nots, and possibly lilies, arranged in a style that is pure Art Nouveau, or Nieuw Kunst in Dutch. The style flourished between 1885 and 1914, and the floral pattern was probably adapted from a printed image, fabric design, book cover, or perhaps an embroidery pattern. The flowers may have held symbolic importance, or they could have just been placed there for their aesthetic value. Each culture has its own language of flowers, known as florography. A flower's meaning, in combination with those of other flowers in a bouquet, could convey nuanced symbolism. Carnations symbolized delicacy in the European language of flowers, and forget-me-nots symbolized fidelity. White lilies, called kerklilies or church lilies in Dutch, were symbols of purity associated with the Virgin. They also signified marital bliss. And so the combination of these flowers in the Kapala we see here, symbolizing fidelity, marital bliss, and purity, may have meant that this sarong was suitable for a new bride. The lower border is a variation on the bow border, which first appeared in the mid-19th century as a development in Indo-European batiks. It resembled the edge of the lacy kabaya or open jacket, which was worn with a sarong, and we can see that displayed in the photo on the right and the detail on the left. The scalloped edge, seen both in the border on the batik and in the garment in the photograph, was typical of the lacy edging on the kabaya. In urban centres, European women wore the combination of kabaya and sarong until the 1920s, when it fell out of fashion and was replaced by European dresses or skirts and shirts. Finally, three versions of a Little Red Riding Hood batik illustrate similarities and differences in the fairy tale batik genre. These examples are from the collection of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in the top left, the Tropen Museum Amsterdam in the top right, a private collection in Australia in the lower left, and the National Collection Little Red Riding Hood batik in the lower right. They're all dated around the beginning of the 20th century, and only one, the one in the top left in the Lackner collection, is signed. It was made in the workshop of Eliza Charlotte van Zuylen, who was an Indo-European batik entrepreneur whose workshop was based in Pekalongen, like that of Lien Metzelaar's. By 1915, van Zuylen had become the preeminent Indo-European batik entrepreneur and the only one whose workshop operated throughout the Japanese occupation. If we look closely at these batiks, we can see that apart from the one in the upper left, the same source image has been used for both the tree, the wolf, and Little Red Riding Hood. The only difference really is that the batik in the lower left corner in the Australian private collection has had flowers and leaves added to the bare trees seen in the other two examples on the right. In all four textiles, the background pattern is geometric, as we've seen previously. The top two examples show the Gedekan or Bilik pattern, which resembles woven bamboo mats or wall panels. These recessive patterns help to unify the designs without fighting visually with the main images. As traditional Esan patterns, they would have been known to the batikers, and the drawing of the background patterns may have been undertaken by less experienced artisans. When comparing similar fairy tale batiks, the different backgrounds, kapala, and border designs illustrate how the batik manufacturer could combine different design elements to create unique textiles. And now I'd like to move to the next batik in the National Collection. It shows Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and it's made in the workshop of Susanna Elizabeth Bauer, who lived in Indonesia in Pekalongen from 1880 to 1944. She learnt the batik trade in her mother's atelier and established her own workshop in 1910. In 1920, Susanna Bauer had 40 batik makers working for her. However, she ordered designs from an external artisan who also supplied other shops. Because of this trade in traced designs, which were taken from printed materials, there are many similarities and indeed identical elements between different batik showing fairy tale designs. The story of Snow White, seen here, is a 19th century German fairy tale that was first published by the Brothers Grimm in 1812 in the first edition of their collection called Grimm's Fairy Tales. The final revision was published in 1854, and it was probably a publication based on this final version that was used as the source material for the batik seen here. Note how the different scenes are separated by floral meanders, possibly again European flowers like cornflowers and forget-me-nots. Bowers assigned the upper left of the Kapala. Behind the bird, which is probably a green Javanese peafowl, is a background of diagonal lines formed from square dots. This pattern was characteristic of many Indo-European batiks and was made with a chunting tulis, the bamboo pen that delivered the wax to the cloth, fitted in this case with one or more square-ended spouts. Note the similar fine diagonal dotted lines and flowers on the Kapala of the sarong in the lower right, also from the workshop of Susanna Bowers. The scene position alongside the Kapala, just to the left of the red border, is clearly seen. The next few slides show scenes from the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It's interesting that on the batik cloth they're arranged without any regard for the narrative sequence. This may indicate that the intended audience was familiar with the story and would recognise the scenes depicted, or that the wearer, unfamiliar with the narrative, simply saw the images as exotic figures without understanding their context. At the lower left, we see the wicked queen consulting her magic mirror, and details of this motif are seen at the right. The image is in fact repeated on the one batik to indicate the queen's numerous consultations with the mirror. She would ask it, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And we see repetitions on the right of the slide here that are seen on the batik cloth. The queen is jealous of her stepdaughter Snow White, who we see at the left of the image on the left of this slide. The mirror has told the queen that Snow White has become the most beautiful woman in the land, and so the queen tells the soldiers, who we see here next to her, on the right of the slide at the left, on the right of the image at the left of the slide, to fetch the huntsman, whom she orders to kill Snow White in the forest. In the centre image here, Snow White on her knees begs the huntsman to spare her life, which he agrees to do. She then wanders alone in the forest and gathers flowers, and that's the image on the right. After consulting her mirror again and realizing that Snow White has survived and is living with the seven dwarfs in their cottage in the forest, the queen decides to use magic to kill her. She finally, after several failed attempts, disguises herself as a farmer's wife and offers Snow White a poisoned apple. Here she is at the window of the cottage in the forest, offering the apple to Snow White. Snow White is poisoned by the apple and appears dead, although she is actually in a deep magical sleep. The dwarves, in mourning for their beloved friend, lie her in state on a bed in a forest. Eventually a prince comes by, sees the beautiful Snow White, and decides to take her on her bed back to his palace. On the way, one of the men carrying the bed stumbles, and the movement dislodges the poisoned apple segment in Snow White's throat, breaking the spell. She awakens, and the prince is overjoyed. In the image on the left, we see her kneeling at Snow White's bedside with some of the seven dwarfs in attendance. And there's a detail of one of the dwarfs in the image on the right. Examples of the type of source materials that may have been used by artisans who traced images for Snow White batiks include the illustrations on the left, which are by Franz Juchner, who was a Polish artist who lived from 1865 to 1926. These two images are taken from his book Sneewittchen, or Snow White, which was published between 1905 and 1910. Note here the scene of Snow White at the little cottage, peering out of the window, rather similar to that scene on the batik. The images on the right are 3 Dutch trade cards from a set of 4 advertising Groot cocoa. They were published around 1890 and are decorated with scenes from Snow White. Both sources show the most important episodes of the story, and these are the ones that are repeated on different batiks. It's interesting to compare the compositions and costume details. Note the kneeling figure of Snow White before the huntsman. In the image in the centre at the top of the slide, she's seen to the right of the image of the Queen peering at herself in the mirror. The kneeling Snow White is very similar in her posture and her relative position to the huntsman to the figures seen in the same scene on the batik. It's interesting to compare the train on the Queen's dress in the lower left to that seen on the batik, as well as the images of Snow White at the window of the cottage, as I've just stated. The final batik I want to talk about is one that depicts the story of Thumbelina, which was a fairy tale written by Danish author Hans Christian Andersen and first published in 1835 in Copenhagen. Details of batik design include, we see on the left here, a house with a driveway leading up to it, probably Mole's house. The mole, one of the central characters in the story, was wealthy, and so Thumbelina's friend, the dormouse, considered him a suitable husband for Thumbelina. Thumbelina was a girl magically born to a couple who had been longing for a child for many years. She was only the size of a thumb and lived and slept in a walnut shell and roamed the garden of her parents' house, hiding under flowers and generally engaging with insects and smaller animals who lived in the garden. In the story of Thumbelina, the mole's wealth is indicated by his sumptuous velvety coat and his extensive underground house with many corridors and rooms. Perhaps this is articulated in the large dwelling shown in the image on the left. There it's shown above the ground with a rickshaw in front. There are some anomalies in the drawing, including the fact that the artist has omitted to draw one side of the gable end of the house. And note again that the scenes are divided by floral and vine motifs, as they were in the Snow White batik. In the story, Thumbelina flees a toad who has stolen Thumbelina from her walnut bed so that she will marry the toad's son. Thumbelina escapes on a lily pad that floats downstream, but perhaps here artistic license has allowed her to ride on a swan's back, as she is shown in the cupola design at the right. The star-faced figures are likely representations of a species of mole called the star-nosed mole. Native to Northeast America, the star-nosed mole is blind and navigates its way along its burrow by feeling the walls with sensitive proboscis arranged around its nose. You can see an image of one on the right of this slide, and the other two images show the type of star pattern on the faces of many of the characters on this batik. As the mole isn't native to Java or Holland, presumably the artists who drew it for this batik had seen printed natural history illustrations of the species, such as this one on the left of the slide, dating from 1850. On the far right of this slide are images of swallows. In another episode of the story, Thumbelina nurses a swallow back to health over the winter while she lives in the field mouse's burrow. The swallow then helps her escape her pending marriage to the mole by carrying her on his back as he flies to the warm southern lands. There she meets a tiny prince with whom she falls in love, and they marry and live happily ever after. An almost identical kind sarong in the Smend collection has an interesting interpretation regarding the appearance of the mole's faces. And I quote from the Smend website, "Sarong, probably made in an Arab workshop in Pekalong in early 20th century. The faces of all the living beings, humans, birds, dogs, and even a horse, depicted in this rural scene have been disguised in some way. Some have been turned into floral-like forms. This feature, as well as the large bouquet of flowers, suggests that the cloth was produced in Pekalong and in one of the many batik workshops run by Indonesian Arabs." In contrast, the figure of Thumbelina on the cupola of the textile in the National Collection has clearly drawn facial features. This figurative detail and the style of drawing with its energetic line may indicate that the textile in the National Collection was made in a Peranakan Chinese workshop rather than an Arab workshop. To conclude, there are some questions and avenues for future research arising from this current study, which is very preliminary and draws heavily on recently published exhibition catalogues and studies of North Coast batiks, to which I'm greatly indebted and which I reference at the end of this paper. Some of the questions that have come out of my study are, can we establish a concordance of fairy tale batik textiles? I feel this would greatly aid research in the future. I would like to know how these batiks were worn and whether any of them are recorded in photographs. I've seen many photos of batiks being worn, but none of fairy tale batiks being worn. Is it known whether there are any extant children's sarongs with fairy tale patterns? It would seem to me that the subject was particularly suitable for children's wear, but all the published fairy tale batiks I have seen are adult-sized. What occasions were these batiks considered appropriate for? Their informal and very domestic nature would seem to me to make them only suitable for informal domestic occasions. Another question is, were they ever used as decoration in domestic interiors? Their composition and the narrative nature of them would seem to me to make them very suitable as hangings within a domestic space, or details of them would be suitable for cushion covers or curtains. Again, what are the sources of the fairy tale imagery? We know that they were traced from books, posters and prints, but have individual source images been matched to specific batik textiles? I haven't yet identified specific sources for any of the 3 batik textiles in the National Collection, but I'm having a lot of fun trying to find them. What was the purpose of this type of batik design? From reading studies of the Dutch communities in colonial Java, I would think that possibly one of their purposes was the establishment and maintenance of European identity and status through visual human culture and images, and of providing a link to European language and literature for children and a means of initiating and reinforcing the study of Dutch literature and language. I look forward to further discussing the textiles in the National Collection with you, and thank you for listening.